The knock on the door was not gentle. It came 3 times, hard and fast, and Eleanor Hartley knew before she opened it that the man standing outside would not be smiling. "Miss Hartley," the man said, holding a folded paper out toward her like a blade. "Your father's debts are now your debts. You have 1 week." Eleanor did not flinch, though her stomach turned cold. She took the paper, thanked him with a voice that did not shake, and closed the door before her knees could give way beneath her. She pressed her back against the wood and closed her eyes. 1 week. 7 days to find money that did not exist, to save a house that held every memory she had left of her father, who had died owing more than he ever confessed. She was still standing there, staring at nothing, when a second knock came, softer this time. She opened the door expecting the same man. Instead, she found a young woman in fine livery, holding a sealed letter with a wax crest pressed into it, a hawk with wings spread wide. "For Miss Eleanor Hartley," the servant said, "from His Grace, the Duke of Ashcombe." Eleanor had never spoken a single word to the Duke of Ashcombe in her life. She had seen him from a distance at 2 balls, tall and unreadable, always surrounded by people who wanted something from him and rarely giving anything back. She broke the seal with trembling fingers and read the short, precise lines within. "Miss Hartley," the letter said, "I have a proposal that may solve your present difficulties. Come to Ashcombe House this evening, alone, and speak to no one of this invitation. Alistair Vane." She read it 3 times. A duke did not write to unmarried women he had never met. A duke did not summon strangers to his home in secrecy. And yet the paper in her other hand, the one that threatened to take the roof from over her head, made the choice for her before her pride could argue. That evening, wrapped in her plainest cloak, Eleanor was shown into a private study lined with books she suspected no one read anymore. Duke Alistair Vane stood by the window with his hands behind his back, and when he turned to face her, she saw a man who looked as though he had not slept properly in weeks. "You came," he said. "I was not certain you would. Your letter did not leave me many choices, Your Grace." A faint, humorless smile crossed his face. "No, I imagine it did not." He gestured to a chair, but she remained standing, and he seemed to respect that. "I will be direct, Miss Hartley, because I have little patience left for anything else. I need an enemy." Eleanor blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "A public enemy. Someone the whole of society believes I despise. Someone whose presence explains why I have suddenly turned cold toward certain circles, without revealing the true reason for that coldness." He studied her carefully. "I am told you are clever, and that you are in need of money rather urgently. I am prepared to pay a sum large enough to clear your father's debts entirely, in exchange for a performance, nothing more. A performance of hatred, of rivalry, of scorn, if you can manage it convincingly. In public, we despise one another. In private, none of it is real." Eleanor studied him, searching his face for the trick she was certain must be hiding somewhere in his offer. "Why me?" "You could hire an actress, a stranger with no name to protect. Because a stranger would raise questions. You are known, respectable, and connected to no one who might interfere. And because," he added, quieter now, "I need someone who can think quickly, and you have just proven that you can." She thought of the collector's paper folded in her pocket, the numbers that would ruin her family name if left unpaid. She thought of her father's study, untouched since his death, the chair he used to sit in still facing the cold fireplace. What happens if I am discovered? If someone learns the truth? Then we will have failed, and the consequences will fall on both of us. But I do not intend to fail, Miss Hartley. And what exactly are you protecting? What is worth all of this? His jaw tightened. That is not part of the arrangement. You perform your role. I protect what I must protect. The less you know, the safer you remain. It was not a comfortable answer, but it was an honest one, and something in his refusal to lie to her outright made Eleanor trust him slightly more than she wanted to. She named her price. He agreed to it without hesitation, which told her the sum, however large it felt to her, was small enough to him that it barely registered. "There is one more condition," he said. "The performance must begin tomorrow night, at Lady Farrow's ball. It must be convincing from the very first moment." Society does not believe rumors that build slowly. It believes what it sees with its own eyes. Eleanor left Ashcombe House with a signed agreement folded against her chest and a strange, hollow feeling that she had just made a bargain far larger than the money involved. The following evening, Lady Farrow's ballroom glowed with candlelight and gossip in equal measure. Eleanor arrived on the arm of her cousin, doing her best to appear as though this were an ordinary evening, though her hands would not stop trembling inside her gloves. She saw him across the room before he saw her, Duke Alistair Vane, dressed in dark blue, speaking to no one, watching everyone. Their eyes met. He gave the smallest nod, so slight that no one else could have seen it. It was time. Eleanor crossed the floor with purpose, and when she reached him, she did not offer a curtsy. "Your Grace," she said, loud enough for the nearest guests to hear, her voice cool as winter glass. "I had hoped, for one evening at least, to avoid the pleasure of your company." The room did not go silent, not immediately, but heads began to turn, conversations began to falter. Alistair's expression shifted into something sharp and cold, a mask so convincing that for one unsettling moment, Eleanor almost believed he truly hated her. "Miss Hartley," he said, each word clipped, "I was under the impression this ballroom was large enough for both of us. It seems I was mistaken. Then perhaps your Grace should learn to share a room without demanding it entirely for himself." A ripple of shocked laughter spread nearby. No one spoke to the Duke of Ashcombe that way, not in public, not ever. Eleanor felt her heart pounding against her ribs, terrified she had gone too far, until she caught the faintest flicker in his eyes. Not anger, but something closer to approval. "You forget yourself," he said. "I forget nothing, your Grace. I simply choose not to bow to men who mistake their title for their character." Gasps. A fan snapped shut somewhere behind her. Alistair's hand tightened briefly around his glass, and then, with a final look of icy disdain, he turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the middle of the ballroom with every eye upon her. By midnight, the story had already traveled the length of the room 3 times over, growing sharper and stranger with every retelling. Eleanor overheard fragments as she moved through the crowd. The Duke had insulted her family. No, she had insulted his. No, there was an old debt between their fathers. No, it was a broken engagement no one had ever heard of. She said nothing to correct any of it. Silence, she was learning quickly, was its own kind of weapon. She found herself, near the end of the evening, standing near an open terrace door, catching her breath from the effort of performing a role she had never rehearsed for longer than one conversation. A voice spoke quietly behind her. "You did well." She turned. Alistair stood a respectful distance away, his cold mask entirely gone now, replaced by something almost like relief. "You could have warned me you intended to look genuinely furious," she said. "I nearly believed you meant it." "I nearly did," he admitted. "You are a better performer than I expected. I had good motivation." She glanced past him toward the ballroom, where the gossip still spread like fire through dry grass. "They believe it already, all of it." "That is the intention. And what happens now? Do we simply continue insulting one another at every gathering in London until your secret, whatever it is, no longer matters?" Something shifted behind his eyes, a shadow of exhaustion he could not quite hide. "Something like that," he said. "For as long as it takes." Eleanor studied him in the candlelight, this cold, unreadable Duke who had just paid a stranger to hate him in public, and wondered exactly what kind of danger required a lie this large to hide it. She did not ask again. She simply nodded, accepted the silence between them, and stepped back into the ballroom to let the rumors carry her name a little further into a story she had not yet begun to understand. Her cousin found her near the refreshment table, eyes wide with excitement she could barely contain. "Eleanor, what on earth happened between you and the Duke of Ashcombe? Half the room is talking of nothing else." "A disagreement," Eleanor said simply, "nothing more." "A disagreement," her cousin repeated, laughing under her breath. "You spoke to a duke as though he were a common tradesman, and you call it a disagreement. I have never seen anything like it. Half the ladies here are scandalized and the other half are delighted." Eleanor forced a small smile and said nothing further, though her mind was already racing far ahead of the ballroom, past the candlelight and the whispers, toward the week that had nearly cost her everything only a day before. Tomorrow, a letter would arrive from Ashcombe House, carrying the first portion of the payment that would save her father's house. Tomorrow, the debt collector who had knocked so hard upon her door would receive an answer he did not expect. On the ride home, alone in the carriage, Eleanor allowed herself to finally breathe. She pressed her gloved hand against the cool glass of the window and watched the dark streets of London slide past, thinking of the strange bargain she had made with a man she barely knew. She thought of the shadow behind his eyes when she had asked what he was protecting, the way his voice had gone quiet and careful, as though the truth itself might break something if spoken aloud. She did not know yet how deep his secret ran, nor how many people would be drawn into the lie before it was finished. She knew only that she had stepped willingly into a role with no clear ending, and that some part of her, beneath the fear and the calculation, had felt more alive tonight than she had in the long gray months since her father's death. Whatever waited for her in the weeks ahead, there was no turning back now. The court had already begun to believe every word. Within a fortnight, the feud between Miss Eleanor Hartley and the Duke of Ashcombe had become the most talked-about quarrel in London. Invitations that once ignored her now arrived daily, hostesses eager to seat her near enough to the Duke to witness fresh sparks between them. Eleanor found herself, for the first time in her adult life, wanted everywhere she went, though not for any reason she could take pride in. She met Alistair 3 more times that week at public gatherings, and each performance grew sharper than the last. At the Ashworth garden party, she accused him, in front of a dozen witnesses, of arrogance so complete that it left no room for manners. At the opera, he returned the favor, remarking loudly to a companion that Miss Hartley's opinions were as unwelcome as they were frequent. Each exchange spread through the city faster than the last, until strangers began to greet her not by name, but as the woman who had dared to humiliate a duke. What no one saw were the quiet meetings that followed, held in the same private study where it had all begun. There, the coldness dissolved entirely. Alistair would pour 2 glasses of wine he barely touched, and they would review the evening's performance as though dissecting a play. "You went further than we agreed tonight," he said one evening, standing near the cold fireplace while Eleanor sat, at last, in the chair she had once refused. "Calling my judgment questionable in front of Lord Ashworth himself. You looked as though you needed reminding that you are not always right," she said. "Besides, it worked. No one doubts we despise each other." "No one doubts it," he agreed, "which is precisely the danger. Lady Constance has begun asking questions." Eleanor straightened. "Your cousin?" She noticed how quickly the quarrel began, and how conveniently it began just as I distanced myself from Lord Percival Doyle's circle. Constance is not a fool. She has never once believed a story simply because it is repeated often enough. And Lord Doyle himself? Alistair's expression darkened, the mask he wore in public replaced now by something far more genuine. Worry, carefully suppressed. "Percival watches everything. He has said nothing directly, but I have seen him smiling at our little performances, as though he finds them entertaining rather than convincing. That troubles me more than open suspicion would." "You still will not tell me what he holds over you?" "No." "Then how am I to protect either of us from a danger I cannot see coming?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite name. "You are not meant to protect me from it, Miss Hartley. You are meant to give me time. That is all I have asked of you, and it is all I intend to ask." She wanted to press further, but something in the set of his jaw told her the conversation had reached its limit for the evening. Instead, she asked a different question, one that had been building in her mind since their first meeting. "Does it trouble you, being hated so publicly, even in pretense?" A faint, unexpected smile crossed his face. "Strangely, no. It is the first honest reaction I have received from society in years. Everyone else smiles at me and wants something. You alone insult me and want nothing but what we agreed upon." "I want my family's house," Eleanor said. "That is not nothing." "No," he agreed softly. "It is not." The following week brought their most difficult performance yet. Lady Constance Wren hosted a small gathering at Wren House, ostensibly a simple evening of cards and conversation, though Eleanor sensed immediately that something sharper lay beneath the invitation. She had been seated, quite deliberately, directly across from Alistair at the card table, with Constance watching them both with the careful attention of a woman, gathering evidence rather than enjoying an evening among friends. "Miss Hartley," Constance said, smiling in a way that did not reach her eyes, "I confess myself curious. You and my cousin seem to appear at every gathering together these days, despite your evident dislike of one another. One might almost think you sought each other out." "One might think many foolish things, Lady Constance," Eleanor replied smoothly, "particularly when society has so little else to occupy its attention. And yet you continue attending the very events he attends. London is not so large a city, my lady. Nor am I obligated to alter my calendar for His Grace's convenience." Across the table, Alistair set down his cards with deliberate calm. "Perhaps Miss Hartley enjoys reminding me of my failings wherever the opportunity presents itself. It has become something of a hobby for her, I understand. A hobby I find quite satisfying," Eleanor said sweetly, "given how many failings there are to choose from." The table erupted in soft laughter, and for a moment, Constance's sharp attention seemed to ease. But later that evening, as Eleanor prepared to leave, she found Constance waiting near the entrance hall, her expression no longer performing polite curiosity. "You are a clever woman, Miss Hartley," Constance said quietly, "cleverer than most who enter this house." I do not know what game you and my cousin are playing, but I intend to discover it. Whatever it is, I hope for both your sakes that it ends before it costs either of you something you cannot recover." Eleanor held her gaze, refusing to let the warning show on her face. "I am not certain what you imagine is happening, Lady Constance, but I assure you, there is no game, only a duke who dislikes me, and a woman who dislikes him in return." "Perhaps," Constance said, unconvinced. "Or perhaps you are both far better performers than the rest of London realizes." The carriage ride home that night felt longer than any before it. Eleanor stared out at the passing streets, turning Constance's words over in her mind, and could not shake the sense that the ground beneath the entire arrangement had shifted, however slightly. If Alistair's own cousin suspected the truth, how long before others did the same? And what precisely would happen to her, a woman with no title and no protection beyond a duke's promise, if the performance collapsed before either of them was ready? 3 days later, at a musical evening hosted by the Earl of Bramwell, Eleanor encountered Lord Percival Doyle for the first time at close proximity. He was a striking man, elegant in a way that seemed almost too polished, with a smile that never quite settled into warmth. He approached her during the interval when Alistair stood across the room, deliberately out of earshot. "Miss Hartley," Percival said, bowing with exaggerated courtesy, "I have heard a great deal about your feud with the Duke. Quite the performance you two have been giving the city." Something in his choice of the word performance made her pulse quicken, though she kept her expression perfectly composed. "I do not know that I would call it a performance, my lord. His Grace and I simply do not care for one another." "Of course," Percival said, his smile widening slightly. "Though I confess, I have known Alistair for many years, since we were boys together, and I have never once seen him waste this much attention on a woman he claims to despise. It is almost as though the dislike serves some other purpose entirely." Eleanor forced a light laugh. "You give His Grace too much credit for subtlety, my lord. I assure you, there is nothing beneath the surface of his contempt for me but contempt itself." "Perhaps," Percival said, studying her with an attentiveness that made her skin prickle. "Or perhaps you are simply very good at hiding whatever lies beneath your own. Tell me, Miss Hartley, has the Duke mentioned me at all in your private conversations?" The question landed like a blade slipped quietly between her ribs. She held perfectly still, refusing to let her expression betray the sudden alarm racing through her. "We have had no private conversations, my lord. Only the public ones the entire city has already witnessed." "How very disappointing," Percival murmured, though his eyes said he did not believe a word of it. "Do enjoy the remainder of the evening, Miss Hartley. I have a feeling this particular story is only just beginning." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing alone, with her heart pounding beneath her carefully composed exterior. Across the room, Alistair caught her eye for the briefest moment, and though his expression remained perfectly neutral for the benefit of any watching guests, she saw the question in it clearly. "What did he say to you?" She gave the smallest shake of her head, a silent promise to explain later, and turned back toward the musicians as the second half of the evening began. But the music barely registered. All she could hear was Percival's voice, quiet and knowing, asking whether the Duke had mentioned him at all, as though he already suspected the truth behind their carefully staged war, and was simply waiting, with patient amusement, for the perfect moment to prove it. The invitation to Lord and Lady Bramwell's country house arrived a week later, and Eleanor nearly refused it outright. A weekend gathering, days spent in close quarters with the same small circle of guests, meant far more opportunity for the performance to slip than any single evening in a crowded London ballroom. But Alistair sent word that his attendance was already expected, and that her absence, after weeks of very public rivalry, would raise more questions than it answered. So she packed a single trunk and traveled 2 days by carriage into the countryside, arriving at Bramwell Hall, just as the first heavy clouds began gathering over the hills. The house itself was old and beautiful, all grey stone and ivy, set among gardens that would have been lovely under any other circumstances. Eleanor was shown to a room on the second floor, overlooking a wide lawn that sloped down toward a lake, and for a few quiet hours before dinner, she allowed herself to simply breathe, away from London's constant watching eyes. That peace did not last. Dinner that evening was a careful dance of civility stretched thin over old tensions. Eleanor and Alistair exchanged the expected barbed remarks across the table, drawing polite laughter from their hosts, though Eleanor noticed Constance watching them both with the same sharp attention she had shown at Wren House. Percival Doyle sat further down the table, saying little, though his eyes moved between Eleanor and Alistair with an interest that made her appetite disappear entirely. By the time the guests retired for the evening, the sky outside had turned a deep, bruised purple, and the wind had picked up enough to rattle the windows in their frames. Eleanor sat alone in her room, unable to sleep, listening to the first fat drops of rain begin striking the glass. She was still awake an hour later when the storm broke in full. Thunder rolling across the hills, rain hammering the roof with a violence that made the entire house seem to shudder. A soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Alistair standing in the corridor, his hair damp, a single candle in his hand, his composure noticeably thinner than she had ever seen it. "I need to speak with you," he said quietly. "Not here. Somewhere no one will think to look." She followed him down a narrow servant's staircase she had not known existed, through a side passage, and into a small library at the rear of the house, its shelves lined with books no one seemed to have touched in years. He closed the door behind them and set the candle on a low table, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, listening instead to the storm raging outside. "Percival cornered me tonight," Alistair said finally, "after dinner, while you were speaking with Lady Bramwell. He asked me, quite directly, whether our quarrel was entirely what it appeared to be." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "What did you tell him?" "I told him nothing, of course. I laughed it off, called the suggestion absurd." He ran a hand through his damp hair, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked genuinely afraid rather than merely careful. "But he does not believe me, Eleanor. I could see it in his face. He is testing the ground beneath us, waiting for one of us to make a mistake." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the sound of it, spoken in that low, unsteady voice, made her chest tighten in a way she did not fully understand. "You need to tell me the truth," she said. "All of it. I cannot help protect something I do not understand, and I am tired of walking blind into rooms full of people who already suspect us." For a long moment, she thought he would refuse again, retreat behind the same careful walls he had kept between them since the very first evening. But the storm outside seemed to have worn something loose in him, some final resistance finally giving way. "My father," he said slowly, "was not the man history remembers him as. Publicly, he was celebrated, a duke of great honor, generous to his tenants, faithful to his duties. Privately, in the last years of his life, he made a series of terrible decisions. Debts, secret and enormous, incurred through gambling he hid from everyone, including my mother. When he died, I discovered ledgers that would destroy our family name entirely if they were ever made public. Proof that the Ashcombe fortune, for years, has rested on borrowed money and quiet, desperate arrangements with men my father should never have trusted. And Percival Doyle knows of these ledgers. His own father held some of that debt. When Percival inherited it, he inherited the proof as well. He has never used it directly against me, not yet, but he reminds me of its existence whenever it suits him. A comment here, a knowing look there. He enjoys the power of it far more than he would enjoy the scandal itself. So the feud between us, Eleanor said slowly, understanding dawning at last, was meant to explain why you distanced yourself from his circle, without revealing that you were trying to quietly manage his silence. Yes, if society believed I had simply grown cold and difficult, obsessed with a public rivalry, no one would question why I stopped attending the same gatherings as Percival, stopped extending him the same easy friendship I once did. It was meant to be simple. A performance to buy time while I found a way to settle what my father owed, quietly, before anyone else discovered the truth. And now Percival suspects the performance itself. Now Percival suspects everything, Alistair said grimly, and I do not know what he intends to do about it. Thunder cracked directly overhead, loud enough to make Eleanor flinch. In the sudden flash of lightning that followed, she saw the exhaustion etched into every line of his face, the weight he had been carrying alone for months, perhaps years, hidden behind that cold, unreadable mask society believed was simply his nature. "I am sorry," she said quietly, "for what your father did, for what it has cost you. You need not apologize for my father's failures. I am not apologizing for him. I am apologizing that you have had to carry them alone." She hesitated, then added, "You are not entirely as cold as the ballroom believes you to be, Your Grace." A faint, tired smile touched his mouth. "Careful, Miss Hartley. If word of that observation ever reaches Lady Constance, our entire arrangement collapses in an instant. Then it seems fortunate that this library appears to hold no other witnesses." They stood in silence for a moment, the storm still raging beyond the walls, the small candle throwing soft shadows across the room. Eleanor became suddenly, acutely aware of how close they were standing, close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jaw she had never noticed before, close enough to hear the unsteady rhythm of his breathing. "Eleanor," he said, and this time her name in his voice carried something entirely different from fear. Whatever might have followed was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside, quick and deliberate, growing closer. Alistair's expression shifted instantly back into careful composure, and he stepped away from her just as the library door opened. Lady Constance stood in the doorway, a candle of her own in hand, her eyes moving between them with sharp, unmistakable suspicion. "I heard voices," she said carefully. "I did not expect to find either of you here, at this hour, alone together." "Miss Hartley became lost on her way back from the kitchens," Alistair said smoothly, the lie arriving so quickly that Eleanor nearly believed it herself. "I encountered her in the corridor and offered to help her find her way, though it seems we have both gotten rather turned around in this unfamiliar house." Constance's gaze lingered on them both a moment longer than was comfortable. "How fortunate, then, that I happened to hear you. The kitchens are on the opposite end of the house entirely, Miss Hartley." "Then it appears I am even more lost than I realized," Eleanor said, forcing a light, embarrassed laugh that felt hollow in her own ears. "I confess I have never been skilled at navigating unfamiliar homes, particularly during a storm such as this." For a long moment Constance said nothing, simply studying them both with an expression that gave away nothing of her thoughts. Finally she stepped aside, gesturing them both toward the corridor. "Perhaps it would be wisest for everyone to return to their rooms before the storm worsens further. I will show you the way myself, Miss Hartley, since His Grace's directions seem to have led you rather far astray." There was nothing to do but follow her, Eleanor's heart still pounding from a danger far greater than simple discovery. The danger of a moment interrupted before she could learn what Alistair had been about to say, and whether some part of her had wanted desperately to hear it. She did not sleep at all that night, lying awake long after the storm had passed, listening to the last drops of rain trailing off the eaves, turning over every word Alistair had spoken in that small, candlelit library. The truth of his father's debts explained so much: the coldness, the caution, the desperate need for a convincing lie. But it did not explain the way her name had sounded in his voice, nor the ache that had settled quietly beneath her ribs when Constance's footsteps had interrupted whatever might have happened next. By morning, the sky had cleared to a pale, washed blue, and the household gathered for breakfast as though nothing unusual had occurred in the night. Eleanor took her seat across from Alistair, and they exchanged the same practiced coldness they always did, a few sharp remarks that drew polite laughter from their hosts. But beneath the table, for one brief moment as she reached for her cup, her fingers brushed his, and neither of them pulled away as quickly as the performance required. Percival watched the exchange from his seat further down the table, his expression unreadable, his silence somehow louder than any accusation he might have spoken aloud. Whatever suspicion he carried had not lessened overnight. If anything, watching them now, he seemed more certain than ever that the feud between the Duke of Ashcombe and Miss Eleanor Hartley was not quite the simple hatred the rest of London believed it to be. The performance, Eleanor understood with a growing sense of unease, was no longer the only thing at risk of collapsing. Something far more real had begun growing quietly beneath it, and she did not yet know whether that truth would save them both, or destroy everything Alistair had worked so desperately to protect. Back in London, the weeks that followed carried a tension Eleanor had not felt since the earliest days of the arrangement. Percival Doyle began appearing wherever she went, with an ease that felt far too deliberate to be coincidence. At the milliner's shop, at the lending library, once even outside her own modest townhouse, standing across the street with his hands folded behind his back as though simply admiring the architecture. She mentioned it to Alistair during one of their private meetings, and watched his expression harden into something she had not seen before. "He is testing you," Alistair said. "Trying to unsettle you enough that you make a mistake, say something in a moment of surprise that confirms what he already suspects. Then I will not give him the satisfaction." "Eleanor," his voice carried a warning she had not heard from him before. "Percival does not simply want confirmation, he wants leverage. If he cannot use my father's debts against me directly, without exposing his own family's involvement in them, he will look for another way to control the situation, and right now, you are the easiest target he has." She wanted to dismiss the warning as excessive caution, but 3 days later, she received an invitation that made his fear feel suddenly, sharply real. Lord Percival Doyle requested the pleasure of her company at a small private dinner, hosted at his own townhouse, with no other names listed among the guests. She showed the invitation to Alistair that same evening, in the private study at Ashcombe House that had become, over the past weeks, more familiar to her than her own drawing room. "You cannot go," he said immediately. "If I refuse, it confirms exactly what he suspects. A woman who genuinely despises the Duke of Ashcombe would have no reason to fear a private conversation with his rival." A private dinner is not a conversation, Eleanor. It is a trap, carefully disguised as an invitation. Then I will walk into it with my eyes open, rather than let him corner me somewhere I have not prepared for. She met his gaze steadily. I am not without resources of my own, Your Grace. I have survived worse than one uncomfortable dinner. He studied her for a long moment, something like reluctant respect softening the hard line of his jaw. If you insist on attending, you will not go alone. I will arrange for someone to remain nearby, someone Percival will not think to suspect. That someone turned out to be Captain Henry Ross, an old family friend of Eleanor's who had served with distinction and returned to London the previous year, quietly building a modest life far removed from the glittering circles she now found herself moving through. Alistair had reached out to him discreetly, aware of the old friendship between Henry and Eleanor's late father, and Henry had agreed without hesitation to wait in a carriage outside Percival's townhouse on the night of the dinner. I still do not fully understand what you have gotten yourself into, Henry said to her the afternoon before, sitting across from her in her small parlor, his expression troubled. A duke does not simply pay a woman to pretend to hate him without a very good reason, Eleanor, and good reasons rarely come without real danger attached. I know what I am doing, Henry. Do you? Because from where I am sitting it looks very much as though you have wandered into the middle of a war between two powerful men, with nothing but a duke's promise to protect you, and dukes have been known to break promises when it becomes convenient for them to do so. Alistair is not like that. Henry raised an eyebrow at the easy familiarity of the name, and Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks despite herself. Alistair, is it? A few weeks ago you had never spoken a word to the man. It is complicated. It always is, Henry said gently, with men like him. Just be careful, Eleanor. I have seen enough of the world to know that when powerful men fight their private wars, it is rarely they who pay the final price for it. His warning stayed with her the following evening as she stepped into Percival Doyle's elegant townhouse, dressed carefully, composed outwardly despite the nerves twisting tight beneath her ribs. Percival greeted her personally at the door, all charm and polish, leading her into a dining room lit by dozens of candles, a table set for two, rather than the small gathering the invitation had implied. I hope you will forgive the deception, he said smoothly, seating her himself. I find larger gatherings rarely allow for honest conversation, and I have grown quite curious about you, Miss Hartley. Curious how, my lord? You intrigue me. A woman of modest means and no particular connections, who somehow manages to hold the attention of the Duke of Ashcombe so completely that he can speak of little else in private, despite his very public claims of contempt for you. Eleanor kept her expression carefully neutral. You give His Grace's private conversations more attention than most, my lord. I was not aware you and he spoke often enough for him to mention me at all. We do not these days, Percival said, his smile thinning slightly. That is precisely what interests me. Alistair and I were close once, Miss Hartley, closer than most people realize. And then, quite suddenly, around the same time your little feud began, he stopped speaking to me entirely. I find that timing rather difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Perhaps His Grace simply grew tired of your company, my lord. It would not be the first time a friendship faded without a hidden cause behind it. Perhaps, Percival said, or perhaps there is a very specific cause, one that involves debts owed by his late father, debts my own family happens to hold significant knowledge of. He watched her closely as he spoke, gauging her reaction with the patience of a man who had done this many times before. You do not seem surprised by that information, Miss Hartley. Her heart pounded, but she forced her expression to remain smooth, composed, faintly bored. I have no idea what you are referring to, my lord. I know very little of His Grace's family finances, nor do I care to. How curious, Percival said softly, that a woman who claims such thorough indifference toward the Duke's private affairs shows no reaction whatsoever to hearing them discussed. The dinner continued for nearly 2 more hours, Percival circling the subject again and again with the patience of a hunter who knew his prey could not run forever, Eleanor deflecting each attempt with careful, practiced calm that cost her more effort with every passing minute. By the time she finally climbed into Henry's waiting carriage outside, her hands were trembling so badly she had to press them flat against her knees to still them. Well? Henry asked, watching her carefully. He knows, Eleanor said quietly. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. He suspects the feud is a performance, and he knows something of Alistair's father's debts. I do not know how much longer we can keep either secret from unraveling entirely. The following week, Percival made his true intentions clear. He approached Alistair directly at a gathering hosted by the Dowager Duchess, Alistair's own mother, drawing him aside with the practiced ease of a man delivering an ultimatum disguised as friendly conversation. Alistair relayed the exchange to Eleanor that same night, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. He proposed an arrangement, in exchange for his silence regarding my father's debts, and his continued discretion about our performance. He wishes me to withdraw entirely from any further involvement with you, and he intends to pursue a betrothal to you himself, publicly, immediately. Eleanor felt the floor seem to shift beneath her. He wants to marry me, as punishment? As humiliation, Alistair said grimly. He does not want you, Eleanor, not truly. He wants to prove that he can take from me whatever he pleases, including the woman society believes I despise, simply to demonstrate the extent of his power over my family's secrets. And if I refuse him, then he threatens to reveal everything, the debts, the performance, all of it, in a single, carefully orchestrated scandal, designed to destroy us both entirely. Eleanor sank into the nearest chair, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them offering any real escape. Adding to the pressure, Alistair's own mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret, had begun pressing him with increasing urgency toward a political marriage of her own choosing, entirely unaware of the danger circling her son from another direction entirely. Your mother wishes you married to someone else, Eleanor said slowly, understanding the full weight of the trap closing around them. Percival wishes to marry me himself, out of spite, and if either demand is refused, everything you have worked to protect collapses regardless. Yes, Alistair said quietly. That is precisely the situation we now find ourselves in. Then we have very little time left to decide what we intend to do about it. He looked at her then, something fierce and protective flickering behind his careful composure, a look that had nothing at all to do with performance. I will not let him have you, Eleanor. Whatever it costs me, I will not allow that to happen. And your secret? Your family's name? I do not know yet, he admitted, the honesty costing him visibly. But I know that I am no longer willing to sacrifice you to protect it. Whatever comes next, we face it together, or not at all. Outside, the city carried on, unaware that the carefully staged war between the Duke of Ashcombe and Miss Eleanor Hartley had finally, dangerously, become entirely real. Percival did not wait long to press his advantage. Within days, invitations began circulating for a grand ball at Doyle House, and beneath the elegant script announcing the evening's festivities ran a second, quieter rumor, carried from drawing room to drawing room with the swiftness such things always seem to travel in London. Lord Percival Doyle intended to make an announcement of great significance that night, one concerning his own future happiness. Eleanor read the invitation with a cold, sinking certainty. He meant to force the matter in public, exactly as their own feud had been forced into existence months before, using the very tactic Alistair had taught her to fear and admire in equal measure. A public declaration, witnessed by all of society, would be far more difficult to refuse without confirming every suspicion Percival already held. He means to propose to you in front of the entire city, Alistair said grimly, pacing the length of his study the evening before the ball, and force your hand before you have any opportunity to prepare a proper refusal. If you decline him publicly, without cause, it raises immediate questions about why a woman with no other prospects would refuse a wealthy, titled suitor. And if you accept, I will not accept him, Eleanor said firmly. I know. But Percival is counting on the fact that a public refusal, delivered without warning, will look either scandalous or suspicious, and either outcome serves his purpose. He does not need you to marry him, Eleanor. He only needs the appearance of chaos surrounding you. Chaos he can then quietly attribute to the truth he already suspects. Eleanor sat very still, turning the problem over in her mind with the same careful calculation she had once applied to her father's mounting debts. Then we do not let him choose the terms of the confrontation. We meet him with a truth of our own, one he does not expect. Alistair stopped pacing, studying her with sudden, sharp attention. What are you suggesting? You have spent months protecting a secret by hiding behind a lie. Perhaps it is time to stop hiding entirely. Eleanor, if I reveal my father's debts myself, before Percival can use them against me, the scandal will still be significant. My family's reputation will suffer regardless of who speaks the truth first. Yes, she agreed, but a scandal you control, spoken in your own words, on your own terms, is a very different thing from a scandal Percival delivers as a weapon meant to destroy you. A man who admits his father's failures with honesty earns some measure of sympathy. A man exposed by an enemy earns only humiliation. He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched the calculation move behind his eyes, weighing the cost of one path against the other. It would mean the end of the performance entirely, Everyone would know, eventually, that our feud was never real. Would that truly be such a terrible outcome? She asked quietly, and something in her voice made him look at her more closely. No, he admitted, his voice softer than she had heard it in weeks. I do not think it would. The ball at Doyle House glittered with the particular brightness that always seemed to accompany gatherings where everyone suspected something significant was about to occur. Eleanor arrived on Henry's arm, her cousin having fallen ill with a convenient headache that Eleanor privately suspected owed more to nerves than to any genuine ailment. The ballroom buzzed with anticipation, and she felt every eye follow her as she crossed the floor, aware that tonight, whatever happened, would be remembered and repeated for months to come. Alistair arrived separately, as their arrangement had always required, standing near the far side of the room with his mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret, whose sharp, assessing gaze found Eleanor almost immediately, and lingered there with obvious disapproval. Eleanor had never spoken to the Duchess directly, but she understood well enough what that particular expression meant. Whatever Margaret believed about her son's feud with this unremarkable young woman, she clearly saw no value in it beyond scandal, and no place for Eleanor in the political marriage she had long envisioned for her son. The evening progressed through its usual rhythms: dancing, conversation, the careful performance of civility that always governed such gatherings. Eleanor found herself dancing once with Henry, who murmured quiet reassurances she barely absorbed, and once, briefly, with Alistair himself, their public rivalry requiring at least the appearance of grudging, tension-filled proximity for the benefit of watching eyes. "Whatever happens tonight," he said quietly, his hand steady against hers despite the danger pressing in around them both, "know that I do not regret a single moment of this arrangement, regardless of how it ends. Do not speak as though it is already over. I am simply being honest with you, Eleanor, for the first time in longer than I care to admit." The dance ended, and they separated with the practiced coldness the room expected of them, though Eleanor's hands still trembled slightly as she stepped back into the crowd. It was nearly midnight when Percival finally made his move, calling for the attention of the room with the confident ease of a man who had planned this moment down to its smallest detail. "My friends," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet ballroom, "I find myself, after much consideration, ready to make an announcement that I hope will bring me great happiness in the months ahead." His gaze found Eleanor across the room, and his smile sharpened into something far colder than mere charm. "Miss Eleanor Hartley, would you do me the very great honor of joining me here, before our friends, so that I might ask you a question I have been considering for some time?" A ripple of shocked whispers spread instantly through the room. Eleanor felt every eye turned toward her, felt the weight of dozens of expectant stares pressing down upon her shoulders. She glanced once toward Alistair, standing near his mother across the ballroom, and saw in his eyes a silent, urgent question. Was she ready? She stepped forward. "My lord," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room, "I am afraid I must decline the honor of joining you for whatever question you intend to ask, and I believe, once I have finished speaking, you will understand precisely why." Percival's confident smile faltered, just slightly, though he recovered quickly. "Miss Hartley, surely such matters are best discussed privately, rather than—" "I disagree," Eleanor said firmly. "You have chosen, quite deliberately, to force this conversation into a public setting, my lord, and so I believe it only fair that the truth be spoken just as publicly." Across the room, Alistair began moving toward her, his expression tight with tension, though he made no move to stop her. This had not been part of their careful plan, but she had made a decision somewhere between the dance floor and this moment, and she intended to see it through. "For weeks," Eleanor continued, her voice steady despite the pounding of her own heart, "the city has believed that His Grace, the Duke of Ashcombe, and I share a deep and genuine dislike for one another. That belief was never true. Our quarrel was a performance, arranged between us, intended to conceal a private matter His Grace was not yet ready to make public." Gasps rippled through the crowd, whispers spreading instantly in every direction. Percival's expression had gone pale, his careful composure cracking visibly for the first time since Eleanor had known him. "Miss Hartley," he said sharply, "I would advise you to consider carefully what you say next." "I have considered it very carefully indeed, my lord," Eleanor replied, "which is precisely why I intend to finish." Alistair reached her side then, and rather than the cold distance the room expected of him, he stood close beside her, his shoulder nearly touching hers, a silent declaration far louder than anything either of them might have said. "The private matter Miss Hartley refers to," Alistair said, his voice carrying easily across the stunned silence of the ballroom. "Concerns debts left behind by my late father. Debts hidden carefully from public knowledge for years. Debts that Lord Percival Doyle's own family has held partial knowledge of, and which he has used, quietly and repeatedly, to pressure me into arrangements I did not wish to make." He paused, letting the words settle over the crowd like a slow, spreading fire. "I have chosen tonight to speak the truth of my father's failures myself, rather than allow Lord Doyle to continue using that truth as a weapon against me and against Miss Hartley, who has done nothing this evening except help me carry a burden I should never have asked her to help conceal in the first place." The ballroom erupted into a chaos of whispers and gasps, the entire assembled company turning toward Percival with expressions that had shifted, rapidly and unmistakably, from curiosity into something far closer to suspicion and disdain. Percival stood frozen for a moment, his carefully constructed power collapsing in real time before an audience he had gathered specifically to witness his triumph. "This is absurd," Percival said, his voice rising with barely controlled fury. "You would humiliate yourself, Alistair, humiliate your entire family name, rather than simply allow this matter to resolve itself quietly." "I would rather speak an uncomfortable truth in my own words," Alistair said calmly, "than allow a man who has spent months attempting to control my life through quiet threats to continue believing he holds any power over me whatsoever. Whatever you intended to reveal tonight, Percival, you no longer have the opportunity to reveal it as a weapon. I have already given it away freely." Percival's gaze swept across the ballroom, taking in the shifting expressions of guests who had, only moments before, been eager audience members for his own carefully staged proposal. Whatever leverage he had built so patiently over the preceding weeks had collapsed entirely, stripped bare in front of the very society he had hoped to use against Alistair. "You have made a grave mistake tonight," Percival said quietly, though the threat carried little weight now, spoken as it was to a room that had already turned decisively against him. "Perhaps," Alistair replied, "but it is mine to make, and mine alone to answer for. That, at least, is no longer something you control." Percival turned and left the ballroom without another word, his departure trailed by whispers that would follow him for weeks to come. The room remained in stunned silence for a long moment after the door closed behind him, before the Dowager Duchess Margaret, of all people, stepped forward from where she had been watching the entire exchange unfold. "Well," Margaret said, her sharp eyes moving between her son and Eleanor, with an expression that had shifted, subtly, from disapproval into something more complicated. "It appears this evening has been rather more informative than I anticipated." "Mother," Alistair began. "We will discuss your father's debts privately, Alistair, and at length," Margaret said firmly, though there was no true anger in her voice, only the weariness of a woman who had perhaps suspected more than she had ever admitted aloud. "But I confess myself curious about one further matter entirely." Her gaze settled on Eleanor, sharp and assessing. "Miss Hartley, you risked a great deal tonight, speaking as you did, in defense of a man the entire city believed you despised. I find myself wondering why a woman would take such a risk, for a man who meant nothing more to her than a business arrangement." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, aware suddenly of how many eyes remained upon her, waiting for her answer. She glanced at Alistair, who watched her with an openness she had never seen from him in public before, no trace of the careful mask he had worn for weeks. "Perhaps," Eleanor said quietly, "the arrangement stopped being merely business some time ago, Your Grace, though I confess I did not fully realize it myself until tonight." The ballroom, still buzzing with whispered speculation, seemed to hold its breath collectively at her words. Alistair reached for her hand, gently, in full view of everyone watching, and this time, there was no performance in the gesture at all. The days following Doyle House brought a storm of a different kind entirely, one made of ink and gossip rather than thunder and rain. Every drawing room in London seemed consumed by the story, retold and reshaped 100 different ways, until Eleanor could barely recognize her own part in it anymore. Some called her brave, others called her scandalous. A few, quietly, called her clever, recognizing in her public defense of Alistair a strategy far sharper than simple sentiment. Percival Doyle did not disappear quietly. 3 days after the ball, he sought a private audience with Alistair at Ashcombe House, arriving alone, his usual polish considerably diminished. Eleanor was present when he arrived, seated in the same study where the entire arrangement had first begun, and Alistair made no move to send her away. "You have ruined me," Percival said without preamble, the moment the study door closed behind him. "Do you understand that, Alistair? My family's association with your father's debts is now common knowledge across the city. Every drawing room whispers not only of your scandal, but of mine. You built that ruin yourself, Percival, Alistair said evenly. The moment you decided my father's failures were a tool to be used, rather than a private tragedy to be left alone. I gave the truth away freely, rather than let you wield it as a weapon. If that decision has cost you something, I find I cannot summon much sympathy for the loss. I could still make things considerably worse for you, Percival said, though the threat carried a hollow, desperate edge now, stripped of the confidence he had commanded only days before. There are details I have not yet made public. Arrangements your father made, favors owed, names that would not survive close scrutiny. Alistair rose from his chair, crossing the study slowly, his expression calm but unyielding. Then make them public, Percival, if that is truly your intention. I have already survived the worst of what you could reveal. Society has already forgiven me a great deal, largely because I chose honesty over concealment. I suspect any further revelations you attempt now will only reflect poorly on you, a man so consumed by resentment that he continues pursuing a ruined feud long after any reasonable person would have abandoned it. Percival's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. This was never meant to happen this way. No, Alistair agreed quietly. I imagine you intended something considerably more satisfying for yourself, but intentions rarely survive contact with the truth, Percival, and I find myself, for the first time in a very long while, unafraid of what the truth might cost me. For a long moment Percival said nothing, his gaze moving between Alistair and Eleanor with an expression caught somewhere between fury and, unexpectedly, something close to defeat. You truly care for her, he said finally, quietly, as though the realization had only just fully settled upon him. This was never simply about protecting your family's secret at all, was it? Somewhere along the way, it became something else entirely. It did, Alistair said simply, without hesitation, and I find I have no interest in explaining that to you further, Percival. Whatever remains between us, I believe it has finally run its course. Percival left without another word, and the door closed behind him with a quiet finality that felt, to Eleanor, like the closing of an entire chapter of danger she had lived beneath for weeks, without fully understanding its true weight. Is it truly over? She asked, once his footsteps had faded down the corridor. I believe so, Alistair said. He has nothing left to gain by continuing. Whatever remaining details he holds, revealing them now would only confirm what society already suspects, that his pursuit of this feud was born of jealousy and resentment, rather than any genuine principle. Men rarely enjoy admitting that publicly. Lady Constance arrived at Ashcombe House the following afternoon, her expression considerably softer than it had been during any of their previous encounters. She found Eleanor alone in the garden, seated on a stone bench beneath a wide oak tree, and settled beside her without waiting for an invitation. I owe you an apology, Miss Hartley, Constance said, folding her hands neatly in her lap. I spent weeks suspecting you of some elaborate scheme against my cousin, when in truth, you were protecting him far more faithfully than I ever gave you credit for. You had every reason to be suspicious, Lady Constance. I understand why you doubted the truth of our quarrel. Perhaps, Constance said, though I confess my suspicion was born partly of my own ambitions, rather than pure concern for Alistair's welfare. I had hoped, for reasons of my own, that his attention might remain undivided by any particular woman for the time being. It seems those hopes were rather thoroughly disappointed. Eleanor studied her carefully, sensing an honesty beneath the words that had not been present in their earlier, more guarded conversations. What ambitions, if I may ask? Constance offered a small, rueful smile. Family matters, nothing that concerns you directly, though I will admit my own position within this family has always felt rather precarious, dependent entirely on remaining useful and agreeable to those who hold real power within it. Watching Alistair choose his own path so decisively, rather than the one his mother intended for him, has been rather instructive. Perhaps it is time I considered choosing my own path as well, rather than continuing to maneuver so carefully around everyone else's. It was, Eleanor understood, as close to genuine vulnerability as Constance was likely to offer, and she accepted it with the same quiet grace she had learned to extend throughout the entire strange, frightening ordeal of the past months. I hope you find whatever path suits you best, Lady Constance. As do I, Constance said, rising from the bench. Though I suspect, watching the two of you together this past week, that my cousin has already found his. The Dowager Duchess Margaret proved a more complicated matter entirely, though even she, after several long private conversations with her son, began to soften toward the possibility she had initially dismissed outright. Eleanor was summoned to Ashcombe House alone one afternoon, without Alistair present, and found Margaret waiting in the same formal drawing room where she had first observed the Duchess's disapproving gaze weeks before. "I will be direct with you, Miss Hartley, as I imagine you have grown accustomed to directness by now," Margaret said, studying her with the same sharp assessment Eleanor remembered from their first encounter. "I had hoped for a marriage that would strengthen this family's political standing, particularly given the difficulties my late husband's choices have now made public. You bring no title, no significant fortune, and no political advantage whatsoever to this family. I am aware of all of that, Your Grace," Eleanor said steadily, refusing to let the words wound her as deeply as they might have weeks earlier. "I have never pretended otherwise. And yet," Margaret continued, "you stood in front of the entire city and defended my son's honor at considerable risk to your own reputation, expecting nothing in return beyond whatever payment your original arrangement promised you. That is not the behavior of a woman seeking advantage, Miss Hartley. That is the behavior of a woman who has come to care for someone rather more than she perhaps intended." Eleanor said nothing, unable to argue against a truth she had only recently allowed herself to fully acknowledge. "My son," Margaret continued, "has spent years guarding himself so carefully against disappointment and betrayal that I had begun to fear he would never allow himself genuine happiness at all. Whatever else I might wish for this family, I find I cannot argue against whatever it is that has finally cracked through that particular defense." She paused, studying Eleanor a moment longer. "You have my blessing, Miss Hartley, such as it is worth, though I expect you to prove yourself equal to the responsibilities that will accompany the position, should my son choose to offer it to you formally." "I intend to, Your Grace," Eleanor said, "in whatever way I am able." That evening, Alistair found her in the same garden where Constance had offered her apology days before, the last light of evening settling gold and soft across the lawn. He sat beside her on the stone bench, close enough that their shoulders touched, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, content simply to sit together without the weight of performance pressing down upon either of them. "My mother tells me she has given you her blessing," he said finally. "She has, though I suspect it came with rather more conditions attached than she stated directly." "That sounds precisely like my mother." He turned to face her fully, his expression open in a way she had come to treasure over these past difficult weeks. "Eleanor, I have spent months hiding behind a performance of hatred, terrified of what genuine honesty might cost me. I find, now that the performance has ended, that the honest truth beneath it is rather simple, and rather less frightening than I had imagined." "And what is that truth, Your Grace?" "That I love you," he said simply, "not the version of you that stood in ballrooms trading insults for the benefit of watching crowds, though I admit I admired that version considerably. I love the woman who chose, again and again, to protect me, even when protecting me endangered everything she had left. I love the woman who saw through every careful mask I have worn for years and asked, without judgment, to understand what lay beneath it." Eleanor felt tears gather unexpectedly in her eyes, months of fear and calculation finally giving way to something far simpler and far more true. "I love you as well," she said quietly. "I did not intend to. I told myself, for weeks, that this was simply an arrangement, a means of saving my family's home and nothing more. But somewhere between the ballroom insults and the storm at Bramwell Hall, it became something else entirely, and I no longer wish to pretend otherwise." He reached for her hand, and this time, there was no ballroom full of watching eyes, no need for careful calculation about what the gesture might reveal to observing strangers. There was only the quiet evening garden, and the two of them, finally free to be exactly as honest with one another as they had always secretly wished to be. "Marry me, Eleanor," he said softly, "not as part of any performance, not to satisfy society's expectations, or settle any remaining debt between us, but because I cannot imagine continuing this life without you beside me, genuinely, for the rest of it." "Yes," Eleanor said, without a single moment of hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you, Alistair." The kiss that followed carried none of the careful calculation that had governed every public moment between them for months. It was simply honest, simply theirs, unwitnessed by any audience except the quiet evening garden and the last golden light settling softly over Ashcombe House. Word of their engagement spread through London within days, and this time, no one doubted a single word of it. The court that had once believed every carefully staged insult between them, now believed, with equal certainty, in the genuine affection that had grown quietly beneath that elaborate performance all along. And for the first time since her father's death had left her drowning in debt and uncertainty, Eleanor Hartley found herself looking toward the future not with fear, but with the quiet, steady certainty of a woman who had finally found exactly where she belonged. The wedding took place on a bright morning in early autumn. the kind of clear, golden day that seemed to promise good fortune to everyone who witnessed it. Eleanor stood at the front of the small stone chapel near Ashcombe House, dressed simply but beautifully, and found herself almost laughing at how different this quiet, honest gathering felt from the glittering, performance-filled ballrooms that had defined the early months of her acquaintance with the man now waiting for her at the altar. Henry Ross gave her away, standing in for the father she wished could have witnessed this day himself, and he squeezed her hand once, gently, before releasing her into the ceremony. "Your father would have been proud of you," he murmured. "Not for the money you saved or the house you kept, but for the courage it took to walk into that ballroom and speak the truth, knowing everything you might lose by doing so." "I did not feel courageous," Eleanor whispered back. "I felt terrified." "That," Henry said, smiling, "is precisely what courage actually looks like, Eleanor. Anyone can act boldly when they feel nothing is at risk." Lady Constance sat near the front of the small gathering, her expression thoughtful rather than guarded, and beside her sat a gentleman Eleanor did not recognize, whose attention seemed to rest rather more often on Constance than on the ceremony itself. Eleanor made a private note to ask about him later, sensing a story of her own beginning to unfold there, quiet and unhurried, in the space Constance had finally claimed for herself. The Dowager Duchess Margaret occupied the front pew with quiet, dignified pride, and though her expression remained composed throughout the ceremony, Eleanor caught her dabbing carefully at the corner of one eye as Alistair spoke his vows, his voice steady and sure in a way that would have seemed impossible to the guarded, careful man Eleanor had first met in his private study so many months before. Of Percival Doyle there was no word at all. He had quietly withdrawn from London society in the weeks following his confrontation with Alistair, retreating to a distant family property to wait out the worst of the scandal his own ambitions had ultimately created. Eleanor found she felt no lingering anger toward him, only a distant, faint pity for a man who had spent so much energy trying to control others that he had never learned to build anything genuine of his own. The ceremony itself passed in a warm blur of quiet joy, and when Alistair finally slid the ring onto her finger, his hand steady despite the emotion clearly moving behind his eyes, Eleanor felt the last remaining traces of fear she had carried since that first desperate knock upon her door finally, completely dissolve. They spent their first months as husband and wife quietly, away from the constant demands of London society, at a smaller estate Alistair owned near the coast, where the air smelled of salt and the mornings stretched long and unhurried before them. Eleanor found herself, for the first time in years, sleeping soundly through entire nights, no longer haunted by debt collectors or careful calculations about survival. "I keep waiting to feel as though something is about to go wrong," she admitted one evening, sitting beside Alistair on the terrace overlooking the water, the sky above them scattered with more stars than she had ever seen from London's smoky rooftops. "I have spent so long expecting disaster that peace feels almost unfamiliar." "I understand that feeling better than most," Alistair said, drawing her closer against his side. "I spent years bracing myself against my father's failures, catching up with me eventually, convinced that disaster was simply the natural order of things for our family. It has taken me longer than I care to admit to trust that this quiet, this happiness, might actually be allowed to last. And do you trust it now?" He considered the question seriously, watching the moonlight ripple across the dark water below them. "I trust it more each day," he said finally, "particularly on evenings like this one, when I am reminded how fortunate I was that a debt collector's threatening letter arrived at your door on precisely the same week I found myself desperate enough to write to a stranger and ask for an impossible favor." Eleanor laughed softly, resting her head against his shoulder. A rather unromantic beginning for a love story, when you consider it plainly. "Perhaps," Alistair agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "Though I have always found that the most genuine things rarely announce themselves as anything remarkable at first. They simply arrive quietly, disguised as something else entirely, and only reveal their true nature once you have already let them in." Word eventually reached them, months later, that Lady Constance Wren had accepted a proposal of her own from the quiet gentleman who had accompanied her to the wedding, a man of modest means but genuine character who valued her sharp intelligence rather than finding it inconvenient, as so many suitors before him had. Eleanor smiled reading the letter that carried the news, remembering their conversation in the garden months before, and the quiet courage it had taken Constance to finally choose her own path rather than continuing to maneuver carefully around everyone else's expectations. The Dowager Duchess Margaret, for her part, gradually softened into something approaching genuine warmth toward her new daughter by marriage, though she never entirely abandoned her sharp, assessing observations of the world around her. She became, in time, one of Eleanor's most trusted advisors in managing the considerable responsibilities that came with her new position, teaching her patiently the particular skills required to navigate society's endless expectations without losing herself entirely within them. As for the debts that had once threatened to destroy the Ashcombe name entirely, Alistair spent the following 2 years working methodically to settle every remaining obligation his father had left behind, using honest transparency rather than careful concealment as his guiding principle. It was slower, harder work than simply hiding the truth might have been, but it earned him something concealment never could have provided: genuine respect, built on solid ground rather than carefully maintained illusion. Eleanor often thought back, in quiet moments, to that first desperate evening when she had stood outside her father's study, reading a letter that threatened everything she had left, certain that her only remaining choices were poverty or ruin. She had never imagined that a duke's strange, desperate proposal would lead her not simply to safety, but to a life richer and more genuine than anything she had dared to hope for in those darkest weeks following her father's death. The performance that had once required such careful calculation, such constant vigilance against discovery, had long since faded into memory, replaced by something far simpler and far more durable. There were no more staged insults to rehearse, no more careful masks to maintain in crowded ballrooms, no more anxious glances exchanged across rooms full of watching eyes. There was only the quiet, steady truth of 2 people who had found each other through the most unlikely of circumstances, and who had chosen, again and again, to protect not merely a secret, but each other. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Alistair surprised her with a small gift, wrapped simply and delivered without any of the elaborate ceremony society might have expected from a duke marking such an occasion. Inside, she found the original letter he had sent her that very first evening, the one that had summoned her to Ashcombe House with nothing but a promise of solving her present difficulties. "Why keep this?" she asked, turning the worn paper over gently in her hands. "Because it reminds me," Alistair said, "of how close I came to losing everything that truly mattered, simply by trying too hard to protect what mattered least. That letter was written by a man terrified of the truth. I would rather remember him clearly, so that I never become him again." Eleanor folded the letter carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept the few possessions she treasured most from her old life before Ashcombe House: a handkerchief that had belonged to her father, a small portrait of her mother, and now, this fragile piece of paper that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, led her exactly where she was always meant to be. Outside their window, London carried on as it always had, full of its endless whispers and carefully guarded secrets. Its performances and its truths tangled together in ways that rarely untangled themselves as cleanly as theirs eventually had. But within the walls of their own quiet home, no performance remained necessary any longer. There was only honesty, hard-won and deeply valued, and the steady, certain love of 2 people who had first learned to trust one another while pretending, for the benefit of a watching world, that they felt nothing for each other at all. The court that had once believed every word of their carefully staged hatred now believed, with equal and lasting certainty, in the genuine devotion that had grown quietly beneath it, and Eleanor Hartley, once a woman desperate simply to save her family's home, found herself instead the Duchess of Ashcombe, standing beside a man who had taught her that the truest stories are rarely the ones performed loudest for an audience, but the quiet, steady ones built patiently between 2 people willing, finally, to be entirely honest with one another.